By 1770, Immanuel Kant was a fixture of the intellectual world. A famous, prolific academic at the University of Königsberg, he was entering the most productive phase of a career that had already made him a household name in Germany. But immediately after reaching this peak, he vanished. For 10 years, the man who had been publishing a constant stream of science and philosophy went completely silent. What kind of realization is so destabilizing that it forces one of Europe's most active minds to abandon his public life and spend a decade in isolation? To understand why a mind chooses absolute silence, we have to look at the immense pressure that forged it. Kant grew up in the bustle of Königsberg, a commercial port and military hub on the Baltic shore of East Prussia. He was born into a modest artisan family. His father, a master harness maker, taught him the values of honest labor and a strict personal independence. His home life stood in sharp contrast to his schooling at the Collegium Fredericianum. This was an evangelical pietist academy where students were forced into daily, intense emotional soul-searching and religious devotion. Kant developed a visceral dislike for this forced emotionalism. He sought sanctuary in the cold, structured logic of the Latin classics, which provided an intellectual refuge from religious paternalism. This youthful reaction against pietism hardwired Kant's mature philosophy. He would spend his life prioritizing rational self-governance over passive reliance on divine grace or external authority. Kant entered the University of Königsberg in 1740. While he began with classical literature, his interests soon pivoted toward mathematics and the natural sciences. He fell under the influence of Martin Knudsen, a professor who introduced him to the mathematical physics of Isaac Newton, a universe defined by precise, deterministic laws. His academic ascent was cut short. The death of his parents stripped him of his financial support, forcing him to halt his studies. To survive, Kant spent 6 years in the East Prussian countryside, working as a private tutor for local families, just to avoid destitution. This delay ensured that his intellectual career was a product of survival and raw determination, rather than the ease of aristocratic privilege. Kant returned to the university in 1755 as an unsalaried lecturer. He had no guaranteed income. He was paid directly by the students who chose to attend his room. He maintained a grueling schedule, teaching up to 20 hours a week on a massive range of subjects, from physics and logic to physical geography and military fortifications. This high-volume hustle forced him into a fluid, cosmopolitan intellectual style. He blended the sensory observation of the British empiricists with the logical systems of German rationalism to keep his lectures fresh. His confidence grew as his reputation spread. He began publishing satirical works that openly mocked the lofty, unproven claims of the dogmatic metaphysicians of his day. This relentless activity built his fame, but it left him with a patchwork worldview. He was standing on contradictory foundations that were about to become vulnerable to collapse. In 1770, Kant finally won his ultimate career victory. He secured the prestigious chair of logic and metaphysics after 15 years of unsalaried labor. But his worldview was immediately threatened by the work of the Scottish empiricist David Hume. Hume argued that causality is not a universal law, but merely a human habit of expectation. This critique effectively demolished the objective certainty of both science and metaphysics. Kant realized Hume's logic was inescapable. It woke him from what he called his dogmatic slumber and forced him to admit that his entire philosophical system was built on a flaw. Because of his hardwired need for rigorous autonomy, he couldn't ignore the problem. He had to stop everything to find a way to rebuild. Kant completely withdrew from public intellectual life, retreating to his study to think through the crisis in total isolation. He spent 10 years wrestling with a single problem. How does the human mind connect with an independent reality? His breakthrough was the Copernican revolution. He realized objects must conform to our minds, that space and time are the templates of human experience. This decade of silence ended in 1781, with the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason. This work synthesized rationalism and empiricism by limiting scientific knowledge to the realm of our experience, while protecting moral faith in an unknowable realm beyond it. Kant's career suggests that true mastery requires the courage to stop the hustle of constant output and sit in absolute silence, facing the destruction of your own dogmas to rebuild them from the ground up. The Enlightenment made a bold promise: human reason could master the universe. But by the middle of the 18th century, that great intellectual engine had finally ground to a halt. On one side of the debate were the rationalists, led by thinkers like Leibniz. They believed the mind could deduce the ultimate truths of the cosmos: God, the immortal soul, the origin of everything, using pure logic. But without physical evidence to anchor them, these deductions piled up into towering, unprovable speculations. On the other side were the empiricists, culminating with David Hume. Hume pointed out that we never actually observe invisible forces like cause and effect. We only see one event follow another. He argued that our belief in physical laws is nothing more than psychological habit, reducing scientific certainty to mere guesswork. Human inquiry was trapped. You could either accept the dogmatic fantasies of the rationalists or surrender to a skepticism that dismantled scientific progress. Both warring factions, however, built their arguments on the exact same premise. They assumed the human mind was a passive mirror, sitting still and waiting to reflect a mind-independent reality out in the world. If our minds are merely receiving data, we have no logical guarantee that the patterns we observe today will hold true tomorrow. We can only report on what we've seen so far, leaving the universal laws of nature entirely vulnerable to sudden change. This vulnerability threatened the equations of physics, and the danger extended further. If every event is a passive reaction to external forces, the concepts of human freedom and moral responsibility dissolve. We become matter in motion, reacting blindly to a mechanical universe. Securing natural science and human morality required an absolute inversion of how we understand the relationship between the observer and the observed. To solve the chaotic, contradictory math of celestial orbits, Nicolaus Copernicus made a radical proposition. He stopped the stars, placed the sun at the center, and put the observer in motion. Immanuel Kant looked at the crisis in philosophy and applied this exact inversion to human cognition. Instead of assuming that our minds must conform to external objects, Kant hypothesized that objects must conform to the built-in conditions of our minds. The human intellect does not sit passively and record. It is an active lawgiver, taking in chaotic sensory input and aggressively structuring it into a coherent picture. Reality is no longer a landscape out there that we simply happen to walk through. It is an active construction built in here, generated by the strict operating parameters of consciousness. The first phase of this construction is what Kant called sensibility. Space and time are not physical dimensions floating out in the void. They are mandatory filtering software built into our intuition. Every piece of raw data we encounter must pass through this framework, organizing it into a rigid spatial and temporal grid. But a grid of raw locations and timings is useless on its own. It provides the layout, but zero comprehension of what those points actually mean. This is where the second phase, the understanding, takes over. The mind deploys 12 pure, non-empirical concepts called the categories. These act as the conceptual gears of cognition. They take the isolated data points and draw vector lines of causality between them, while bounding other points together into unified blocks of substance. Through this synthesis, the categories stitch the raw, filtered data into a recognizable, rule-governed object. Kant summarized this mutual dependence with a strict rule: thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. Because this cooperative machinery processes every single experience we will ever have, we can absolutely guarantee the objective laws of physics. The physical world will always obey causality and mathematics, because the human mind is writing those rules into the physical world as it experiences it. Yet we process millions of these synthesized objects every day. What prevents this continuous stream of perception from fracturing into a disconnected mess? Kant pointed to a necessary higher-order self-consciousness he called the unity of apperception. It is the persistent I think, that accompanies and anchors every single perception and category. An objective, unified reality exists entirely because this singular I think holds the cognitive architecture together, maintaining a continuous thread of consciousness. This internal machinery operates flawlessly on the data directly in front of us. But when the mind tries to process the universe as a completed, unconditioned whole, reason puts itself on trial. Kant called the resulting collisions the antinomies. These are instances where reason generates mutually exclusive, logical proofs that end up shattering each other into dust. For example, using pure logic, reason can perfectly prove that the universe must have a beginning in space and time. Simultaneously, using the exact same logic, it can prove with equal validity that the universe has no beginning and is infinite. These fatal contradictions happen because we are misusing our cognitive software. We are applying the forms of space, time, and the categories to grand concepts that provide zero actual sensory input to process. Human reason, therefore, is strictly and permanently confined to the boundaries of sensory experience. It is entirely incapable of peering past those boundaries to know the ultimate reality of the universe. This final consequence of the Copernican shift is known as transcendental idealism. It is a doctrine that permanently fractures reality into two distinct realms. First is the realm of phenomena, the world of appearances. This is the realm structured by our minds, where strict scientific and mathematical laws rule absolutely. Second is the realm of noumena, the realm of things in themselves. This is reality as it exists independently of our perception, hidden forever behind an impenetrable veil. By splitting reality, Kant resolved the intellectual crisis of his age. Newtonian science is saved because its ironclad laws apply with absolute certainty to the world of phenomena. At the same time, human freedom, morality, and the soul are preserved because they reside untouched in the unreachable noumena, safe from the determinism of physics. As Kant declared in his defining realization, he had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Our impenetrable ignorance of true reality is not a failure of reason. It is the exact mechanism that guarantees our moral autonomy. Immanuel Kant's daily walk in Königsberg was so rigidly scheduled that his neighbors could set their watches by it. It was a fitting routine for a man who had helped prove that the physical universe operates as a giant, unbreakable machine governed strictly by cause and effect. But this deterministic physics creates a terrifying existential vacuum. If human beings are nothing more than biological matter in motion, reacting to external stimuli according to natural laws, then free will is an illusion, and morality cannot exist. Kant rebelled against the logical conclusion of his own physical theories. To carve out a space for human freedom, he introduced the concept of the good will. He declared it to be the only thing in the universe that can be considered good without qualification. A good will defies biological programming. It acts righteously simply because it is a moral duty, completely ignoring the pull of self-interest, natural sympathy, or physical desire. If such a good will truly exists, there must be a part of human nature that operates outside the mechanical laws of physics. It means we are actually free. To define exactly how this freedom operates, Kant formulated a supreme moral principle, the categorical imperative. This is the unconditional law of pure reason that dictates how a truly free agent must act. His first rule is the formula of universal law. We must only act on principles that we could rationally want every human being on Earth to follow simultaneously. If universalizing an action, like lying to get out of trouble, would cause society to collapse into contradiction, the action is forbidden. He refined this further with the humanity formula. We are absolutely required to treat other humans always as ultimate ends in themselves, and never merely as tools to achieve our own goals. True autonomy is not doing whatever you want. It is having the strength to obey a rational moral law that you give to yourself. This raises a critical question. In a universe dominated by the laws of physics, How can we scientifically prove that we possess this free will? Kant's answer is surprising. We cannot prove it scientifically, but we don't have to because of what he calls the fact of reason. The fact of reason is the inescapable, heavy weight of moral obligation that every human being uniquely experiences. It is the conscience, the universal human feeling of guilt, or the undeniable inner voice telling us we ought to have done otherwise, serves as the ground-level proof that we are free agents capable of making choices. By his late career, Kant faced a grand philosophical crisis. He had successfully mapped two entirely isolated domains, the physical machine of nature and the inner realm of absolute moral freedom. He viewed the isolation between these two worlds as a great chasm. The physical world governed by natural law and the human world governed by freedom were barred from having any mutual influence on each other. To solve this, he published his final major critical work, The Critique of Judgment, aiming to construct an architectural bridge spanning that exact chasm. The text argues that our experiences of beauty and biology are not random. They act as the necessary links proving that the physical universe is actively hospitable to human freedom. The first pillar of Kant's bridge is aesthetic judgment, specifically the mind-bending experience of the sublime. He defines the mathematically sublime as the mind's attempt to process vast, staggering magnitude. When we look at something so massive that our physical imagination fails to take it all in, instead, we experience a momentary cognitive collapse. Kant pointed to historical structures as evidence of this overwhelming magnitude. Looking at the Great Pyramids of Egypt, their massive scale dwarfs human perception. He applied this logic to architecture like St. Peter's Basilica. The imposing dome and expansive interior stretch the limits of what the eye can process. He contrasted this with the dynamically sublime, the experience of nature's terrifying destructive power. A raging hurricane or an erupting volcano threatens to annihilate us. While these experiences initially make us feel physically powerless, they ultimately trigger a profound, thrilling pleasure. This pleasure arises because the sublime reveals a supersensible faculty within us. As we comprehend the infinite or the terrifying, we realize that our capacity for rational thought is vastly superior to any physical force in the universe. The second half of Kant's bridge is teleology, the study of biological purpose. He focused his observations on something as simple as a blade of grass. He realized that mechanical physics cannot fully explain a living organism. Unlike a machine, an organism's parts mutually cause and sustain the whole. The leaves nourish the roots, while the roots sustain the leaves. Because we cannot fully explain organisms mechanically, we are forced to view them as natural purposes, acting as if they were designed. This introduces the idea that nature itself has an ultimate goal. Kant scaled this biological purposiveness up to human society. If human beings, with their moral autonomy, are the ultimate ends of nature, our political structures must reflect that innate dignity. His political endgame required constitutional republics to eventually form a non-coercive League of Nations. The goal of this global structure was the achievement of perpetual peace. Kant frames human freedom as the ultimate, purposeful destiny of nature, driving history toward global political harmony. Despite this soaring intellectual architecture, Kant remained bound to harsh physical realities. In his later years, he clashed directly with the Prussian king, facing severe censorship over his writings on religion. He also endured a tragic mental decline. The once revolutionary mind that mapped the limits of reason slowly failed him, leaving him confused and unable to work. He died quietly in 1804, finally swallowed by the very biological and physical laws he had spent his life trying to transcend. But while the man himself succumbed to the deterministic machine of nature, the architecture of his thought had already permanently escaped his physical body. The immediate aftermath of Kant's work was an intellectual explosion across Europe, sparking the movement known as German idealism. Successors like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel expanded upon Kant's assertion that the human mind shapes reality, carrying his theories into new territory. The frameworks established in his critiques provided the basis for modern concepts of universal rights and self-determination. These ideas grew to form the unshakable foundation for contemporary views on human dignity and political sovereignty. While we remain physically small in a vast cosmos, Kant argued that the moral law within us grants us a dignity that no mechanical law of nature can override.